Well, howdy doody person. In this video, I'm going to show you how to get started with AG Grid and Vanilla Javascript application. On the left hand side, we have a simple app with only index.html and the basic HTML boilerplate titled AG Grid app with a heartwarming greeting. On the right hand side, we can see that the app is working. Now let's start by importing AG Grid to our project from Unpackage Content Delivery Network. This is some code I prepared earlier. Alrighty, a quick look at the CDN imports. The first import is AG Grid component with all the logic. This is grid structural CSS, and finally one of the provided AG Grid themes. You need all three for the grid to work. To demonstrate what I mean, initially I will comment out both CSS imports. Now let's get coding. First, let's create a div for the grid with ID myGrid. Create a script, save the reference to myGrid container, and every grid needs some columns and rows. Let's create grid options constant and create an array for column definitions and row data. So the grid options is an object that you provide to the grid with all the configuration for the grid, including methods, properties, and events. To create the grid, we pass the grid container and grid options to the component. For this example, I will make 3 columns and call them make, model, and price. For the row data, I will add 3 sample rows. Each object here will represent 1 row inside the grid. So this is all the configuration for the grid, and here I'm creating a new instance of the grid and passing down all the configuration via the grid options. Okay, so the column defs are here and row data is here. Please note that the column def fields make, model, and price define row data. You can see each row has make, model, and price. So the make column will display Vauxhall, Ford, and Volkswagen. On the right hand side, there we can see that the grid is displaying. The data is there, but it doesn't look pretty. This is because we have not included the CSS styles yet. Let's do it now. First, let's uncomment both CSS files. The first import is the core CSS the grid needs to work. Next import is the theme CSS. I'm using AG Grid theme Alpine, which comes with AG Grid. To apply the theme, we add class with the theme name to the grid container. And lastly, we add the grid size. And can you guess what time it is? That's right, it's grid time. Alrighty, how about a neat trick where by adding the word dark to the theme import and component class, we can use the dark Alpine theme. Let me just undo the dark theme, comment out the theme import, and we can see that the grid is displaying without a theme. This could be useful if you would like to create a theme from scratch. Just remember, you need the core structural CSS for the grid to work. Now the width and the height of the grid is determined by the size of the container. Set the size you need and the grid will adjust. But wait, there's more. Column definitions and row data can be updated via AG Grid API. Let's do that now by getting some data from the server. Here's some code I prepared earlier. We're using fetch to get data from this URL. Result of this is JSON, so it's converted into JavaScript object. Then we call setRowData API via grid options to set row data inside the grid. Whew, that was a mouthful. And now we can see lots and lots of rows. Why don't we have a closer look at the column defs here? There are many properties you can set. For example, I will enable sorting and filtering by adding sortable and filtering properties. Now, you can see that sorting and filtering is enabled for all the columns. So all you need to enable sorting and filtering are these 2 properties in the column defs. There are many properties you can set on column defs. I just use these 2 to show how to set things up. Please check our docs to see all the things that can be done with columns. And I know, you're thinking there's a lot of repetition here. Let's sort this gammy now by adding default coldef and set sorting and filtering here to work across all columns. Default coldef is here. You can see sortable and filtering here and not on each individual column definition. As you can see, sorting and filtering is still working on all columns. So that was a quick intro into column definitions. So let's move on to grid component properties. There are tons of things you can configure with grid properties. I will add 2, row selection and animate rows. Row selection allows us to select rows. When I click on the grid, you can see rows being selected. By holding Control, I can select multiple rows, and by holding Shift, I can select a range of rows. The second property, animate rows when it is on and the rows are moving. We can see how smoothly they roll into their position. And just like column diffs, there are many multifarious and various grid properties. Yeah. Check the docs for what to do, see how the grid can help you. Alrighty, now moving on to grid events, of which there are many, fired by the grid. I will add on cell clicked event and create the handler. It will print the event to the console. Now let's open the console, and when I click some cells, you can see events printed. And guess what? The grid can throw so many events, you will think it's a never-ending party. Check the docs to see what they are. There's one more topic I would like to speak about. It is how to use Grid API. So let's create a button to call Grid API for deselecting rows. Yes, we will deselect rows. A quick look at what we've created. We made a button with a click event and an event handler to deselect rows. The grid puts the API object on the grid options when the grid is created. So in the event handler, we can call API deselect all whenever the button is clicked. Now let's select a few rows and call the API by clicking the button. And you can see the API called and rows deselected. And we're done. This is getting started with AG Grid in Vanilla.js app. We started with a basic HTML file. We put AG Grid inside. We configured columns. We configured the AG Grid, listened to events, used AG Grid API. This video is the first video how to use AG Grid in Vanilla JavaScript. Continue watching the videos and learn much more.